What if everything you've been doing for your oral health has been solving the wrong problem? Not because you're lazy, not because you don't care, but because the information you were given was incomplete from the very beginning. Think about that for a second. You brush, you floss, you rinse, you repeat. You buy the expensive toothpaste with the clinical sounding name on the label. You carry mints everywhere like they're a form of armor. You tilt your head slightly when you talk to people up close. You cover your mouth when you laugh just a little too hard. And still, that feeling doesn't go away. That quiet, persistent doubt that follows you into job interviews, first dates, family dinners, and morning meetings. The kind of doubt that doesn't announce itself loudly. It just sits there, in the background, always. If that sounds familiar, I need you to stay with me. Because what I'm about to walk you through isn't another list of tips you've already tried. It's not drink more water or cut back on coffee. It's something much more fundamental. Something that connects dots most people, including most people who consider themselves health conscious, have never had connected for them. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's start at the beginning. I still remember the exact moment this topic shifted for me. It stopped being just another common problem. The kind of thing you see mentioned in toothpaste commercials between smiling faces and white teeth, and became something I couldn't ignore. I was listening to someone describe their daily routine, methodical, thorough, almost obsessive in the best possible way, brushing twice, sometimes 3 times a day, using an electric toothbrush, flossing every night, tongue scraping in the morning, oil pulling on weekends. They had tried every product on the shelf and a few that had to be ordered online, and yet, every single morning, the problem was still there. They weren't embarrassed to talk about it with me, but they were clearly exhausted by it. And what struck me most wasn't the frustration. It was this. They genuinely believed they were doing something wrong, that it was their fault, that somehow, despite doing everything by the book, they were still failing at something as basic as keeping their breath fresh. That broke something open in me, because this wasn't a hygiene problem, this was a knowledge problem, a misdirection problem, and I started digging. Here's the question that changed everything for me. Why does bad breath come back? Not why does it happen? We all know the basics of that. But why, even after brushing, even after rinsing, even after doing everything right, does it return within hours, sometimes within minutes? If the solution was really just about brushing and rinsing, it would stay gone. But it doesn't, and that means the solution we've been sold is incomplete. To understand why, you have to understand something that doesn't get nearly enough attention in everyday conversations about oral health. The mouth is not just a place where teeth live. It is a living ecosystem, one of the most complex microbial environments in the entire human body. Right now, inside your mouth, there are somewhere between 500 and 700 different species of bacteria, not as invaders, not as problems to be eliminated, as residents, as a functioning community that, when balanced, plays an important role in your health, including your digestion, your immune responses, and yes, your breath. The issue isn't bacteria. It never was. The issue is imbalance. Let's slow down here because this is where most people's understanding of oral health completely breaks down. We've been conditioned to think of bacteria in the mouth as the enemy. The ads reinforce it constantly. Kill 99.9% of bacteria, eliminate germs, fight the invisible threat. And so we treat our mouths like battlegrounds. We deploy the strongest mouthwashes, we scrub aggressively, we try to sterilize. But here's what the science actually says. You cannot, and should not try to, eliminate all oral bacteria. The mouth is designed to host a complex microbial community. When that community is balanced, the beneficial bacteria keep harmful strains in check. They compete for resources, produce compounds that regulate pH, and help maintain the structural integrity of your gum tissue. When you disrupt that balance through harsh antiseptic rinses, poor diet, high sugar intake, chronic stress, certain medications, or even aggressive brushing, you don't create a cleaner mouth, you create a power vacuum. And certain strains of harmful bacteria are very good at filling vacuums. These are primarily anaerobic bacteria, meaning they thrive in low oxygen environments. And where is one of the lowest oxygen environments in your mouth? Below the gum line. In the spaces between your teeth and your gums, in the pockets that form when gum tissue becomes inflamed and begins to pull away from the tooth surface. This is where the story gets deeper. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed a little blood when you brush? Maybe on the bristles of your toothbrush, maybe when you spit after rinsing. A slight pink tinge in the sink. Most people see this and think one of two things. Either they brush too hard, or it's just one of those things that happens sometimes, so they brush a little more gently, or they brush with the same intensity and just ignore it. What almost nobody thinks is, this is my body sending me a signal. But that's exactly what it is. Bleeding gums are not normal. I want to be very clear about that because it's one of the most pervasive myths in everyday oral health, that a little bleeding is just part of the deal. that it means you need to floss more, that it'll sort itself out. Healthy gum tissue does not bleed from normal brushing. When your gums bleed, it means they are inflamed. And inflammation is the body's response to something, in this case bacterial activity at and below the gum line. Here's what's happening at a physiological level. When harmful bacteria accumulate along the gum line and begin to form what's known as a biofilm, a structured community of microorganisms embedded in a protective matrix, the immune system responds. White blood cells rush to the area. Inflammatory signals are released. The gum tissue becomes engorged with blood as part of the defensive response. That's why it bleeds so easily. The tissue isn't weak, it's actively fighting. But here's the problem. If the trigger isn't removed, the inflammation doesn't resolve. It becomes chronic. And chronic inflammation is one of the most insidious things that can happen to living tissue. Over time, the gum tissue begins to break down. The protective seal around each tooth starts to loosen. Pockets deepen. And those pockets become the perfect habitat for the anaerobic bacteria we talked about, the ones that produce the compounds responsible for persistent, treatment-resistant bad breath. The connection isn't coincidental. Bleeding gums and chronic bad breath are very often two symptoms of the same underlying process. Let's get specific about what's actually creating that odor. The main chemical culprits behind persistent bad breath are called volatile sulfur compounds, VSCs for short. The most common ones are hydrogen sulfide, methyl mercaptan, and dimethyl sulfide. If any of those names sound familiar, it might be because hydrogen sulfide is also the compound responsible for the smell of rotten eggs. Methyl mercaptan is associated with decomposing organic matter. These are not pleasant chemicals, and they are being produced inside your mouth. Here's how it happens. Certain anaerobic bacteria, particularly species like Porphyromonas gingivalis, Treponema denticola, and Fusobacterium nucleatum, which are collectively referred to as the red complex in periodontal research, feed on proteins. Specifically, they break down amino acids through a process called proteolysis. As a byproduct of this protein breakdown, they release volatile sulfur compounds. The deeper the bacterial colonies are able to establish themselves, the further below the gum line, the further into periodontal pockets, the more protected they are from anything you can do on the surface. Your toothbrush can't reach them. Your mouthwash, unless it's a very specific formulation with proven subgingival penetration, doesn't reach them either. So you rinse, you brush, you temporarily reduce the odor at the surface level. And then, within hours, the bacteria that weren't reached begin producing VSCs again. This is why nothing seems to work permanently. You're not failing. You're using the right tools in the wrong location. Someone I spoke to during this investigation described it in a way I've never forgotten. They said it felt like cleaning the surface of a wound without ever treating the infection underneath. Every day, you wipe the surface clean. And every day, the underlying infection continues. The wound doesn't heal. The smell doesn't stop. And after a while, you start to wonder if it ever will. That's exactly the dynamic that's happening in millions of mouths right now. The surface looks clean, the teeth are brushed. But underneath, at the level of the gum tissue and the bacterial biofilm below it, the process continues unchecked. And this leads to a cycle that I want to walk you through, because understanding the cycle is what breaks it. Stage 1, bacterial imbalance begins, usually triggered by a combination of factors: diet high in fermentable carbohydrates, inconsistent cleaning, stress, dry mouth from mouth breathing or medication, or simply a period of neglect. Stage 2, harmful bacteria begin to colonize the gum line. A thin biofilm forms. At this stage, professional cleaning or improved home care can often disrupt it entirely. Stage 3, the immune system responds to bacterial presence. Gum tissue becomes inflamed. Bleeding begins during brushing or flossing. Most people notice this but don't connect it to anything significant. Stage 4, if the biofilm isn't disrupted, it calcifies over time into what's called calculus or tartar. This hardened deposit cannot be removed by brushing. It creates a rough surface that harbors more bacteria and pushes further under the gum line. Stage 5, pockets deepen between teeth and gums. Anaerobic bacteria colonize these pockets. VSC production increases. Breath becomes persistently malodorous in ways that don't respond to surface-level interventions. Stage 6, tissue and bone begin to be affected. This is clinical periodontal disease. At this stage, the consequences extend far beyond breath. Tooth stability, systemic inflammatory burden, and research increasingly suggests connections to cardiovascular health, metabolic function, and other systemic conditions. But here's what I need you to understand. That cycle doesn't have to complete, and it can be interrupted at any stage, but the earlier, the better. And the key to interrupting it isn't doing more of the same. It's doing something fundamentally different. So what does the science actually say about addressing this at the root level? Let's talk about it systematically. Biofilm disruption, mechanical and chemical. The most important intervention for gum health isn't the toothpaste you use. It's the physical disruption of biofilm. Research consistently shows that mechanical removal, meaning the physical action of brushing and flossing, is the foundation. But technique matters enormously. Most people brush in a way that cleans tooth surfaces reasonably well, but almost completely ignores the gum margin. The area where tooth meets gum, that junction, is precisely where biofilm accumulates most aggressively. Angling your brush at approximately 45 degrees toward the gum line and using gentle circular or sweeping motions toward the gum margin makes a significant difference in biofilm disruption compared to the standard back-and-forth technique most people use. Flossing, when done correctly, disrupts interproximal biofilm, the bacteria living between teeth and just below the contact point of the gum. Curving the floss into a C shape around each tooth and gently sliding it beneath the gum margin rather than simply snapping it between teeth and pulling it out dramatically increases its effectiveness. The microbiome, not the sterilization approach. As we discussed, using strong antiseptic rinses as a long-term daily strategy can disrupt the balance of the oral microbiome. Some research suggests that alcohol-based mouthwashes, used aggressively over long periods, may alter the microbial composition in ways that allow opportunistic pathogens to recolonize more readily after each use. More targeted approaches, using compounds that specifically inhibit the virulence of known periodontal pathogens without globally decimating the microbial community, are showing greater promise in research settings. Things like stabilized chlorine dioxide formulations, certain botanical extracts with documented antimicrobial properties, and probiotic approaches that introduce competitive beneficial strains. Diet and its direct impact on the oral ecosystem. This is consistently underestimated. The bacteria that produce VSCs and drive gum inflammation feed primarily on proteins and fermentable carbohydrates. Diets high in refined sugars and simple starches create a consistently favorable environment for harmful bacterial populations. But it goes beyond just sugar. Certain foods have documented effects on the oral microbiome. Polyphenol-rich foods, berries, green tea, dark leafy vegetables have shown antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory effects in oral tissue research. Vitamin C is critical for collagen synthesis in gum tissue, and deficiency has well-documented associations with gum fragility and bleeding. Hydration is also more important than most people realize. Saliva is the mouth's natural defense mechanism. It contains antimicrobial proteins, buffers acid, and mechanically flushes debris. Chronic dry mouth, whether from dehydration, mouth breathing, or medication side effects, dramatically increases bacterial colonization rates. Stress, the invisible accelerant. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, has documented immunosuppressive effects when elevated chronically. Research in psychoneuroimmunology has shown that chronic psychological stress measurably impairs the immune response in gingival tissue, making it less effective at controlling bacterial populations. Additionally, stress is associated with increased mouth breathing, changes in diet, and reduced attention to self-care routines, all of which compound the bacterial imbalance. This is why some people find that gum problems flare during particularly stressful periods of their lives. It's not coincidence. The biology is real. Professional disruption. The reset you can't skip. There is no home care regimen, no matter how diligent, that can remove hardened calculus once it is formed below the gum line. Professional cleaning, specifically what's called scaling and root planing for deeper pockets, is the mechanical reset that creates the conditions under which home care can actually work. Think of it like this. If your gutters are completely blocked, running water through them doesn't clean them. You have to physically clear the blockage first. Then maintenance works. Professional cleaning removes the calcified substrate that harbors the deepest bacterial colonies, smooths root surfaces to make recolonization more difficult, and reduces pocket depth so that home care can reach where it needs to reach. This isn't just about clean teeth. It's about restoring the structural conditions for a healthy microbial environment. I want to take a moment here and zoom out, because this conversation isn't just about breath, and it's not just about gums. In the last 2 decades, research into the oral systemic connection has accelerated dramatically. What's emerged is a picture that should change the way everyone thinks about oral health. Periodontal bacteria don't stay in the mouth. When gum tissue is chronically inflamed and compromised, bacteria and their byproducts can enter the bloodstream. The same bacterial species associated with periodontal disease, Porphyromonas gingivalis in particular, have been found in arterial plaques, in synovial fluid in arthritic joints, in brain tissue in Alzheimer's research, in diabetic wound tissue. The research is still developing, and it would be an overstatement to say that gum disease causes these conditions. But the associations are strong enough that major cardiovascular, diabetology, and neurology research bodies are actively investigating the mechanisms. What we can say with confidence is this: chronic oral inflammation is a source of systemic inflammatory burden, and chronic low-grade inflammation is implicated in nearly every major chronic disease of modern life. Taking your gum health seriously isn't just about how your breath smells in a conversation. It's about the long-term inflammatory load on your entire body. But let's come back to Earth for a moment, because while the science is important, it's not why most people are watching something like this. They're watching because of how this feels. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from dealing with a problem that nobody talks about openly. Bad breath is one of those problems that exists in a strange social silence. People around you notice it, but they don't say anything, and you sense it. You read the micro expressions, the subtle lean back, the hand that moves to cover the nose for just a moment, the conversation that ends a little earlier than it might have, and you carry it, alone. It affects how you present yourself, how much you speak up in rooms, whether you lean in during conversations or keep a careful distance, whether you allow intimacy or create reasons to avoid it. This is not a small thing. Confidence is built in thousands of tiny moments across each day, and when each of those moments is shadowed by that one quiet worry, is it happening right now? It accumulates into something much heavier than the original problem. People who finally address the root cause of this don't just report fresher breath. They report getting something back, a version of themselves that was always there, one that speaks up in meetings, that laughs without covering their mouth, that leans in instead of leaning away, one that isn't spending cognitive energy every moment on something that should just be resolved. That is what's actually at stake here, not just a fresher mouth, a freer life. So where do you go from here? The first thing I want you to do is stop blaming yourself. If you've been dealing with persistent bad breath and nothing has worked, it isn't because you're not trying hard enough. It's because you've been working with an incomplete map. You were told the problem was on the surface, so you treated the surface. Repeatedly, diligently. But now you know the territory goes deeper. The second thing I want you to understand is that this is resolvable. This isn't a life sentence. Gum inflammation, even when it has been progressing for years, responds to the right interventions. The tissue has remarkable capacity for recovery when the bacterial burden is properly reduced and maintained. The third thing is this: information changes everything, but information without action stays just information. We've put together a practical guide in the first link in the description. It goes into the specific strategies, the approaches backed by current periodontal research, and the shifts that people who finally resolved this made in their daily routine. It's not a product pitch, it's a map, the kind of map that should have come with the toothbrush. Click the link in the description and take a look, because you now have context that most people never get, and context is what makes the difference between spinning your wheels and actually moving forward. Let me leave you with this. The problem was never your effort. You were trying hard, maybe harder than most people would have. You were doing what you were told to do, and when it didn't work, you did more of it. That's what most people do. That's what the system expects you to do. But the real shift, the one that actually changes things, isn't about intensity. It's about direction. When you understand that bad breath and bleeding gums are downstream symptoms of a bacterial imbalance that lives below the gum line, in an environment your toothbrush cannot reach, the entire strategy changes. You stop pouring energy into surface cleaning and start thinking about the ecosystem, the biofilm, the tissue, the microbial balance. You stop reacting and start resolving. That's the shift. And everything I've laid out in this video, the microbiology, the inflammatory cycle, the chemistry of VSCs, the oral systemic connection, the emotional weight of living with this unresolved, it all points toward one conclusion. This problem is more understood than most people realize. It is more treatable than most people have been led to believe. And the gap between where you are now and where you want to be is almost entirely filled by the right information applied consistently over time. Not miracles, not overnight fixes, just the right direction. The guide in the description is the next step. Take it. And if this kind of investigation, where we go past the obvious, past the marketing, past the surface, and into what's actually happening, resonates with you, then subscribe to this channel. Because this was one thread of a much larger fabric. And in the videos ahead, we're going to keep pulling.